We're gonna start, thank you. He's not in the committee anyway. Okay, we're gonna start the Budget and Finance Committee, meeting. It's the first Budget and Finance Committee meeting for the 2019 for the year. And, we have one bill. We're gonna go by the agenda. If you have the agenda, we're just gonna follow it. So, let's see, record shows that all members of the committee are here, and so is Mr. Glacier, Mr. Robinson, Mr. McLean, and Ms. And the members of the committees are Ms. Malta and Mr. Hendricks.
Yep.
Yes, thanks. So Bill 1, will you read Bill 1, Mr. Clerk, please?
Bill one, is a supplemental appropriation of $130,000 for the early intervention
Okay. So, many of, yeah, 120. Yeah. Yeah, right. And that, out of that 120, the city is obligated for 30,000, I think it is. So is anybody from the administration would like to speak about this first?
I can certainly speak to it briefly, is that this is the portion coming from the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development as part of the early intervention program that will be their grant, which amounts to 80% of the total amount of, we'll get to $150,000 that we can spend going through the management audit and other things that we'll be working on over the course of the next few months.
Thank you, Mr. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Heisel. And many of you know that we started this process last year. We finally coming to the to start the actual early intervention program soon. The first thing that we need to do is do the RFP. We've been working on the RFP. I think it's ready. We have some recommendations to the RFP that most council members who, at least the people who are in the committee, Mr. Zuko, Mr. Hendricks, and I discussed it with Mr. Hartzell, and also obviously our city clerk, Mr. Hanlon, and the administration. Mr. McMahon participated, and I think that RFP is ready to go. I think if not today, not this week, early next week. Okay. So the process will be that once they come in, once we find the right person, the right professional consultant, we start the program, and that will be done in July, right? We're looking to
July. Yep.
end of July. So that's what we're hoping. In the process, we're certainly going to be taking information and anything we can from those people who want to offer information to us, so we can talk to the consultant, information that will help us. Okay, so and I know I'm looking at Mr. Hoffman, who's been here for a long time and has a lot of information that he would like to share. So we're just talking to him personally because he's always offered to help and has some ideas, so that may help us as well. So we want to cut costs, which is difficult, but we also want to bring all the ways of managing our finances, I think, as well as hopefully bringing some non-tax revenues, if I may call it that. Okay. So, any comments from my colleagues on that? Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Grady. The only thing that I wanted to say, you actually sort of touched on it, is I had just wanted us to try and include Mr. Hoffman in terms of identifying potential revenue when we get to that part with the RFP. I'm happy to see that he had spoken to you and that you're on board with that as well, because I think that's a benefit. He has been coming to us for a long time with those ideas, and I think this is the perfect opportunity to explore those ideas. So I would thank you and Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Zuckel and Mr. Hartzell and Mr. McMahon for considering that as you move forward with the RFP, and thank you for your diligent work on this.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Councilman, and I thank you for your support as well. And anybody from council, obviously, as well, people from the public, I think, should be encouraged to send information. We may use it, we may not, it depends, okay? Whatever is right for the city and the citizens of the city. Okay, Mr. McLean, over there.
So just one quick question. Will there be open meetings where citizens can have input in this?
You know, I think we should.
There will be two meetings, one meeting for public input and one meeting for the conclusion of the plan.
Okay.
So it's only two meetings. Yeah, I thought we would have more than two.
There is enough room.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking like, the reason why I'm thinking more than two is because if we can do it regionally, one in the west side, one in the east side, one in the south side, and then one in Southern City here, might work even better if we can.
I was also gonna suggest, Mr. Grady, if it's possible, I don't know if we can do this, but to look at trying to utilize social media in the same way that the comprehensive plan has been utilizing it to gain access, maybe through our website and through the Speak Up Allentown function. We could encourage people through our social media platform to go to Speak Up Allentown and contribute through that vein, even if we couldn't have more than one or possibly two public meetings.
Excellent, great suggestion. And that should be easy to do, because we already have the system to do it. Any comments from the public? Mr. Freshman. Please,
Thank you there, Mr. Grady.
Thank you.
Lou Hirschman, 405 North Gilmore, Allentown. At last meeting, there were a couple of questions on reopening the budget. The mayor had an opinion, he never shared it with anyone, even though we paid for the solicitor with our tax dollars. And the solicitor also said there was an opinion, but we never saw a written opinion. I mean, as I know things go, solicitor's opinion doesn't mean it's a legal opinion, it's the solicitor's opinion. So we really never had no legal opinion on reopening the budget from the mayor or the solicitor. So bill number one, it says amending the 2019 general fund budget. Is that reopening the budget?
Is that for us to open the budget?
Are you reopening the budget?
Well, that's not really.
Well, sure, you're amending it to 2019.
I don't know if he considers anything besides this was on the budget, I mean, was on the agenda.
You're opening it up, you're amending it, you're opening it up. I mean, I brought up to try to save taxpayers money. The mayor wanted us to pay 27% taxes to keep the pools open. I tried to say to people that rent homes, rent increase so they don't get booted out of their homes, showing homeowners so you don't have to pay such high taxes. And I tried to get you guys to open the budget to make cuts. And now you're looking how to make cuts, but you're reopening the budget to do this. And I'm asking, how can you do this? And the mayor said you couldn't do the other one.
Well, it's,
You're opening it up, amending when you're opening.
I would like to have a legal opinion.
I would get legal opinion, Mr. Chairman.
Because
I really do, because I would look.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me just, go ahead, you're gonna talk about this, right?
Well, yes, being that that's what we're discussing, even though it's not germane to the bill.
Of course it is.
No, it's not, Mr. Hirschman. It
You're
says
opening up
nothing
the
to
budget.
do. No, Mr. Hirschman, we are amending the budget to accept the state grant. What was stated by the solicitor was that the tax rate cannot be changed after the first of the year by the mayor or by council.
And I agree with the
But if
solicitor.
but Mr. Hirschman, you don't, obviously you wouldn't be up
I
here.
agree with the solicitor,
Okay.
change the tax rate, I
All
said
right.
how we can reduce the tax that he paid, how you do the bill.
All right, let's not get into
It's
it
a
back,
tax rate.
let's not get into it back, Mr.
You're the one
Hirschman.
that voted.
Let's not get into back and forth here, that's not what we're here. We are about this particular bill.
That's right, you're opening, why not reopening the budget?
And I told you that. Okay, so, thank you, Mr. Hirschman. All right, anybody else from the public? Mr. Hoffman.
Hello, my name's Joe Hoffman, and my address is different. 761 St. John Street, Apartment 2, still Allentown. I'll never do that. Thank you so much for offering me the chance to help you out with this. I really think that my 4 or 5 decades of grantsmanship work will help you with this, because there are many other ways to generate revenues from non-tax and non-fee sources besides grants. I think all of you are pretty familiar with how grants work. I'm not going to bore you with those kind of details. But there are many other places to go. One of the things, I'll just mention one because I know you don't, I only have 2 minutes, I'm definitely going to mention one. One of the things that worked well for me was in the city of Hazleton. In that city, they had a public library that was on the verge of being decommissioned because it could not afford to buy modern computer equipment. And they were literally down to the last 2 months before that event was going to happen. I went up to meet with them because my company at that time had a building renovation project scheduled with them, and obviously that would not have happened if the library couldn't have stayed open. So when I went up and heard their situation, Hazleton was in as bad or worse a financial situation as you guys are. And a lot of the communities up in the coal regions are like that. So I thought for a minute and I looked around and I said, you ever talk to people across the street? And they said, no, that's just the bar association. That's where the lawyers meet. And I said, yes. I said, isn't that a source of income? If you go to the bar association and ask for help in your situation, I would think they could give you 3 types of help. I think they could give you a direct contribution to get you over a hump right now. I think they could give you an annual appropriation that you could put in your budget and you knew you were going to get it every year. And I think they would love to put together a special event fundraiser for the purpose of getting the general public involved in the fundraising of the library. Well, I was very happy to say that all those 3 things worked. And the third part of it, the special event, continues to this day. I believe that the city has many opportunities to build public-private consortiums that will generate money for it without raising taxes. And I think they can be done on the basis of occupation, I think they can be done on the basis of location, and I think they can be done on the basis of acceptance of specific programs. I think one of the things that you need to look at in your 2020 city budget, we often make things as an either or. Is this program needed? And when we answer yes, we say, well, then we've got to have taxes pay for the thing that's needed. That's not necessarily so. If you get to it early enough and look at several specific programs that are in the budget, you can have it both ways. You can continue to fund the program, just not through tax sources, and in that way save the taxpayer money without sacrificing service. Those are just minor examples of the kinds of things I would like to bring up. And I really am grateful that you're going to give me the chance to help you all out, because it's what I've done all my life. I don't want a penny for it, and I would be glad to contribute back to my town that 3 generations, including my father, who worked for City Rec, and his father, all lived in this town. So it really would be something close to my heart, and I thank you for bringing my name up and hopefully putting me in position to help out.
Thank you very much.
Sorry I ran over.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman. If you can put a list together so when we're ready to ask you and engage you, you'll be ready. Thank you. All right, anybody else from the public? If not, I'd like to get a motion from one of the committee members.
I'll make the motion that this be moved favorably to the full council.
Okay,
Second.
that's made, second, all in favor, please respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Right, thank you. All right, so let's talk about the 2018 budget report, version 1 for December 2018. So this is the first one. I'm going to start by saying, in revision of what was presented, it looks like we actually are not doing that bad in some of the departments. Most of the, if you look at the percentage year to date, in the revenue session, we're doing pretty good, I would say, to the end of the year. And Mr. Hartzell is obviously going to talk about it. And then some of the other departments, I think with the exception of the golf department, golf fund, I think we didn't have such a great year, obviously. But as we move forward, in some of the expenditure, we actually looks like we underexpended in some department as well. Except the premium pay, which is really concerning to me. But I will ask Mr. Hartzell to run us through. I have a couple of questions, but you can give us a rundown on how we're doing so far. Please, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'm going to focus everyone's attention primarily on pages 1, 2, and 3, which is the first view of where we're at the general fund in cash purposes as of December 31st. It has been a very good year for revenue. We came in above what our estimate was going to be on taxes by about $400,000. We came in well above estimates on permits and licenses, and above estimates on charges for services. And when you go over to page number 2 and you look down at the very bottom of page 2, you will see the year-to-date revenue coming in at a little over $107.9 million. That is cash that has come in during 2018 to the general fund. So $107.9 million in revenue. Now go on to page 3. And you take a look at the trends that we're seeing in the individual categories for personnel, for services and charges, materials and supplies. Nothing that is really out of what we expected during the course of the year. You come down to the very bottom and you see that our expenditures at the bottom of page 3 year to date in the general fund are at 105.4 million, roughly. We had budgeted this year an anticipated deficit of about $3.5 million. We're in that ballpark. As of right now, on a cash basis, we're actually $2.5 million to the good, the surplus of $2.5 million. And I expect those numbers are going to change a little bit, but not very much in the final 2 cash reports as we get ready for the CAFR and the modified accrual presentation of the 2018 funds. But I can gladly say that that additional surplus that as it appears that we're going to have is going to be added to the cash reserves of the general fund, giving us a much better start to 2019, the situation that we're in. And a lot of people, I think, deserve a lot of credit for that one. Obviously, we've been making some significant impacts in the work we're doing with inspections to raise fees in that area. I think the EMS program has definitely demonstrated that it is generating revenue in accordance with its activities very, very well. I think the tax revenue came in quite nicely during the course of the year. And on the expenditure side, I think I know that Mr. Garidi had expressed his concerns on premium pay, and I certainly understand that. But I think overall, outside of that department heads have really done an outstanding job of constraining expenditures during the course of the year. And that there were actually some legitimate reasons, even on the premium pay, that if you compare, it's certainly well over budget, but it's actually very much similar to where we were in the actual cost per premium pay for 2017. So the dollar amount didn't change a whole lot, just it went well above what we had budgeted for it. I think that's a very good start for the year, and I know that particularly the issue had come up when we had the discussion last week about the budget and the tax rate, et cetera, that we were admonished, and I think rightly so, that we need to work on controlling expenditures during the course of the year as carefully or even more so than what we do in generating revenues. And I think what you're seeing here at the end of December is a pretty good indication that the that our city managers are doing a very good job in trying to constrain their costs, and that we're not just trying to move forward on the basis of additional revenue, but also that we're trying to control costs as much as we can. I'm only going to point out a couple of other things that really strike me as very pertinent. There are many other pertinent things in here, but I wanted to touch on a couple things we've talked about tonight. I want to go to page 5 for a minute, and this is to point out the question that both Ms. Moda and Mr. Zuckel had raised. If we go to page 5 in the risk fund, and you go down into expenditures and you see account 37 for insurance, medical, dental, life, and pharmacy, you will notice very clearly that what I talked about earlier, that in May and June, we had a significant bump up in the costs in there compared with what had been the steady costs for the months that were surrounding it. Mr. Glazer mentioned October as being a high-cost month, and I think there were some bills that were paid from previous months that were included within what ended up getting paid in October, which helped to increase that amount significantly. But definitely what we saw in May and June were the bump ups at that point that were the first signs for me that we were probably going to overspend on insurance. And I will be more focused on that if I see something like that coming, to let you know about it ahead of time and in more detail in the coming year. Going over to page number 11, these are the pooled and non-pooled cash balances. Mr. Chairman, you had mentioned about the Gulf Fund and that being in a negative balance, and obviously we have a lot to focus on there, but I am happy to say that as of the end of December, that every other one of our cash balances in all of the other funds in the pooled and the non-pooled accounts are in the black. And we're in a significantly better position than we were at the end of December in 2017 with respect to the balance that was in the general fund. As you can see, that amount of 8.6 million, that is not including what is in the stabilization fund. That's on top of the stabilization fund. So I'm very pleased with where we're sitting here at the end of December, and am hopeful that we will see trends continue. I think we had a very good fourth quarter. Whether it's a trend that is going to continue in a similar vein for the first couple of quarters of 2019, it's too early to tell. Mr. Robinson has certainly admonished about not getting too excited about when things go well, to be sure that the trend keeps up with expectations for a while. And so we're keeping our eyes very much open on that. The final thing I'm going to mention just with the vacancy report is that we had projected $2.1 million in the budget for 2019 for the vacancy factor, and you will see that for 2018 that would be essentially maintaining a continuation of where we ended up in the general fund for the year at $2,157,000. Obviously, if we are able to fill more vacancies, the vacancy factor will not be as big, but I'm also confident that because of the additional balance that we're going to start the year with in the general fund, that we will be able to afford being able to fill more of those vacancies quickly. And if there are any other questions regarding other items in here, I'm certainly happy to talk them over, but I thought those were the most important ones to bring up.
Thank you, Mr. Hassel, and thank you for it. And I also want to take this time to say thank you to all the people, for all the staff and the administration for all the work that they've been doing to keep expenses down and being frugal in some cases to make sure that we have a surplus from what was budgeted. Just quick questions. We've got a couple of questions. Since we're already on page 11, let me just ask you that question. A couple of questions here. So, see, at the bottom here, the non-pool and pool, does it mean that we have $33 million in the bank?
In the bank, yes, sir.
Okay. And that divided, so that when we started in January, we had 22 million, so we have $11 more million in the bank than we had last year.
Than where we were at January 31st. I would need to go back and look at the 17 to see what the end of December number was. I'm guessing the December 17 is a bit higher than 22 million. The January is usually the month where that balance is at its lowest, but I'm very happy with where we're at in terms of the balance at the end of December.
Mr. Glazer
December
has that.
17 was 28,202,000.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So we're 5 million to the better compared with December of a year ago.
Okay. And is all that money in one bank account, in different bank accounts?
Thank you for a good question. Everything that is under pooled cash is under what we call the central treasury account. And so anything that is in central treasury is divided up among the particular items that you see in pooled cash. All of the things that are in the non-pooled cash have their own separate accounts.
Okay. So we have, what, 20? There was a non-pool, was it 10 million, 10, almost 11 million?
Correct.
All right. And that's a TD, is that TD?
The TD primarily is going to be our central treasury account, but many of the other accounts that we moved over that were with Wells Fargo, TD took over those. There are a few instances like the Pliget accounts, which are run out of Harrisburg. Those would be separate, like the loan investment that you see, which is the Manning and Napier, that's separate from TD, but the bulk of these are with TD.
Okay. Thank you. Was there a reason why the fire department had such a high premium pay? Looking at page, I'm actually looking at page 10.
Page 10, yes. And I expect that early in the year because EMS is included in that total, and I know that early in the year we were still filling up those last two positions. And there were numerous instances, including the matter with the warehouse over on Franklin Street, in which we needed to have fire staff in place for an extended period of time. It clearly was over budget by a ways. It was not all that different from the actual spend for the previous year, and I would be more comfortable having Mr. Weir or Mr. Gratz giving some details about what led to those things, but it was in terms of, it was well over budget, but it was fairly consistent with the previous year.
Just for the sake of including everybody, I have a lot of other questions that I wanted to clarify, but if anybody in the dais, give the committee people the first shot at this. Anybody in the committee has any questions about the finance? If not, I'll open it up to anybody in the dais. Mr. Robinson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick questions, Mr. Hartzell, in going through this. When we're looking on page 1 at the permits and license fees, it's great that we have an increase overall, and I see that a lot are in really good shape, but there's two numbers here that concern me. One is the zoning permits and fees, and I know we've discussed this before, that a lot of that had to do with the budgeting, that you had budgeted for an increase in the fees, which did not go through last year. So are we going to see that stabilized now, since some of those fee increases are going to go into effect?
The budget for this year is correct with respect for 2019 with what we are expecting in terms of revenue. We aligned that one properly.
So I guess my question would then be, and this might not, I don't know if Mr. Glazer might have the right report with him to answer this, but I'm curious what the year-to-date number for 2017 would have been when it was properly budgeted. Did we come in at 100? Did we come in at 90?
Came in at 87.
87, okay. So, all right, so we're looking at that normally it comes in a little what's under budgeted when properly reflected for the rate.
Yes, sir.
The pre-sale inspections at 53%, I know this has actually been quite a robust sales market. In fact, we even had members from the Realtors Association to come tell us that last week about what a robust market it is. Is this something where we perhaps over budgeted in the number? Or are we looking at that there might be an issue here where we're not capturing the revenue we should be capturing, and there might be a sort of a hole in the system?
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I'm going to defer to Mr. Leitner on that one. I think part of it was a prioritization of staff issues that they were working on rental unit inspections to a greater degree. And that became a bigger issue than doing the pre-sales ones, at least for a large portion of 2018. That's what I understand, but I would talk with Mr. Leitner in more detail.
Right, and I'm 100% behind the idea of prioritizing rental inspections, but I also realize that one of the easiest times to make sure that critical issues in a home are fixed is during a sale, because you have two parties that are potentially involved who can negotiate as to who's going to pay for them. And I'm concerned that if we're not doing that, we are going to see a lot of our housing stock go through a substandard position. So if we could, Mr. Hanlon, if we could maybe get a report from Mr. Leitner on that, as to what that is, I would appreciate that, because I think that's something we need to look into. When we're looking at, this is a sort of a combination question on page 1 and on page 3. So we look at the printing and copying fees, and then we look at the printing and copying expenditures. There's a pretty significant difference there. I'm assuming a lot of that has to do with the new printing contracts that we're dealing with, having our own machines as opposed to the previous rental. I'm just curious, I know that Mr. Glazier was on top of this when it came to every department during budget season. Should we start to see the difference between those two numbers balance out a little better now?
So if you're looking at account 26 on page 3 as opposed to, I believe, account 3106
On page 1, yes, it's 109% in 3106, it's
On
only
the revenue
30%,
side.
right, and it's 30% on this side. I'm just concerned when we're looking at the budget for each department and for the funds. Obviously, if we can save them having to put money out for something into the general fund that they're not doing, it would be good.
We'll look into that a little bit further.
Okay.
And a lot of that was being centralized within IT during 2018, and so I need to
Right.
look at that a little further.
Right, I'm just curious if we're gonna see that number get more normalized as we move forward.
Sure.
On page 2, and this is something that I know you and I have spoken about, but I think it's worth having the conversation in these meetings, which is when we look at 6195, the casino fee, we saw that it was 114% of the revenue, but with the sale coming up, we're looking at a company that doesn't have a significant experience with table games. Also, a report recently that the Sands itself is looking to buy property in either Brooklyn or Queens. We know a large percentage of their customers come on buses from the Manhattan or the New York area. So is it something that as we start looking towards our long-term financial planning, especially since we have the EIP program coming in and our 5-year plans, to try and become less reliant on this money for general fund expenditures, so that if it does come in at these levels, great, we can look to putting that into our reserve funds, but starting to sort of wean ourselves off of expecting it, so if the numbers do start to drop, once the sale is complete, that we have insulated ourselves from that problem.
I think we will need to look at that one very carefully, Mr. Robinson, for the reasons you mentioned. I had an experience with that, as I talked with you about. There are 3 casinos in Detroit that helped provide with revenue for city operations there, and when Hollywood Casino opened in Toledo, Ohio, just down the road, raised a big concern regarding some of the traffic that was coming into MGM or Motor City or Greektown, and I think that's a very important one to look at. If it would explain if we were to see a significant downward trend in revenue there, that we would need to accommodate that. I totally agree in future years and not expect to have that much coming.
I know that the payments come, I think it's 3 times a year, or quarterly, excuse me, as I'm looking at this. Do you have a way that you track that? So you have a sense to, before we get the payment, this is roughly what we think the payment is going to be?
On February 1st, we will see the 4th quarter payment along with the licensing fee payment, which is essentially amounts to a double payment that we get in February.
Okay.
And when I look at that number for February of this year, we're looking at a number that came in a little under $1.6 million. That is going to be the tip-off. How we compare with $1,564,000 is going to be the first indicator to me of where the trend is going, because we did budget for this year, I think at $4.5 million, so we stayed pretty constant with what we had put in there. So if that number comes in on either side of $1,564,000, that'll be a tip-off one way or the other as to that we didn't get it quite right.
Excellent. On page 3, this is, Mr. Grady sort of touched on this. And if you would feel more comfortable with Mr. Weir answering the question for fire, perhaps we could also get Mr. Leitner. I know it's a much, much smaller amount. We're only looking at $109,000 as opposed to 1.9 million. But we do see a 150% number for community and economic development. And it seems that that police and fire would be the driving numbers on premium pay, because obviously we're looking at public works, which is actually the third largest, and that came in at 61%. So they kept their numbers down. But just an indication as to, I'm assuming it had a lot to do with the inspection program?
I believe so, yes. The mayor was just asking about this. I'm looking on page 10 so I can see that monthly detail.
Yes, I'm sorry, that's also on page 10 as well.
Yeah, that's where I'm looking at it at this point, and yes, I believe that was entirely what drove it.
Is there a way, Mr. Hartzell, that we could perhaps, and this might be a ridiculous idea, but track, so if we have an inspector that goes in and they identify a number of problems, obviously the property owner, to fix those, is also going to have to pull permits. Is there a way that we can sort of track based off of, we spent X number of dollars on inspectors going out and doing X number of issues, but we also increased the number of permit fees in a corollary amount by having this many inspectors out doing this work? Is there a way to track that, or is that not feasible?
I expect Mr. Leitner has been doing that, because this was
Excellent.
Exactly the issue. I think there was concerns being raised about whether the fees that we were charging in this particular area were in line with the actual costs
Right.
that were being generated. So I would expect that there are some very careful review being done exactly on that.
And if it's possible, Mr. Hanlon, maybe we could get Mr. Leitner to provide us with that, because I think it's a good understanding of, obviously, public safety is public safety. But when we're looking at a large increase like that, even though it's a small actual number, if we can see a corollary that it's also increased revenues by a significant amount, and also the intangible benefit of increasing the quality of life in the neighborhoods, I think then it gives us a better idea to gauge if that money is being spent wisely or not. On uniforms, on line 56, we're looking at 123%. Is there a particular reason for that, or department that was increased in its uniform budget? I didn't notice anything just paging through quickly, but I was just curious.
I'll have to look into that further. I'm not sure on that one.
Okay.
If I could just weigh in, I think that you would find that fire departments, they got some personal safety equipment this year, and I think the standard changed where they need to inspect their turnout gear every year instead
Yes.
of every other year, would probably be the drivers there.
I thank you for reminding me of
I
that.
actually had that circle, and that's what I considered anyways.
Yep, and I thank you, Mr. Glazer, for jogging my memory. The last question that I have, Mr. Hartzell, is on page 11. If I'm reading this correctly, we're looking at, in the first few months of Manning and DePere's work, investing a net profit of about $20,000.
That is correct.
Excellent. Is that sort of in line with what you were looking at? Is that better than? So,
I was, in terms of that particular investment, I have been in touch with our investment advisor with Manning and Napier. Not knowing where our cash situation was going to be until just this report came out, I had wanted to keep a portion of that $3 million in cash, in pure liquidity, in case we needed to draw upon it. Now that our balances are looking very solid for the year, I have advised him to go ahead and put all of that million, along with most of the other that's in there, back into treasury bonds and have a life cycle on them that's going to run the remainder of 2019. So we should see a very nice interest return on that as the year progresses.
excellent. I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Mr. Hartzell, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. In fact, you touched, you every point that you touched, I had circled. So I'm glad that you did, and you did it very eloquently, so thank you very much. I still have some more, but I will give somebody else an opportunity in case they have some, so they can get a chance to also talk. If not, I'll take him over again. Right, so, page 1, let's start there. Amusement device tax. For some reason, that's the first one I had, and it looks like what do you consider amusement device? What is, what are we using? I didn't think we had it.
Yeah, there's a very specific category of machine that falls into, and we've had discussions internally because it's such a small revenue source as to whether we need to continue to assess that particular tax. It's not gone beyond the discussion stage at this point, but there's a very small category of devices that falls into that, and yeah, that's about what we get for it on an annual basis.
So that's like machines or game machines somewhere?
I think so. I'm gonna get the specifics on the type of it, but I think that's particularly where we're looking at, some kind of non-electronic games.
Okay. Let me go back, let's see here. There were a couple of things on the permits and license, Mr. Robinson touched in most of them. Let me see, I think there was one, we talked about pre-sales inspection. I'm gonna give you a hard time on that because, I just wanna talk about business privilege. And the business privilege license, I thought we were getting more businesses into the city, but it looks like it's low.
I'm glad you brought that one up. I figured it would. If you go back to February in that particular account, when we were doing the reconciliations that are done with the NIS, which happen a lot at that point of the year, there was some money that was drawn that should not have been from the business privilege license that ended up going to the NIS. We have been in close consultation with NISDA about reconciling that issue as we head into the 2019 reconciliation period. If that item is left alone as it should have been, we would have actually had a collection that was more, that reflected what the budget was going to be. It was that transfer in February that caused the negative, that caused the number to be depressed as it looks like.
Okay. That's a good explanation, thank you. And then let's talk about, zoning permits, Mr. Robinson talked about billboard. Okay, and we're getting more and more billboards, I think, throughout the city, but revenue was lower. And I'm not sure if that includes all the, those digital billboards that we got. Do they include all of those as well?
Yeah, let's see here a minute. If I go to page 2, a lot of the electronic advertising that we're putting in you see item 6139, kind of middle of page 2. When it comes to electronic billboards, that's where we're actually putting in those
Marketing and
revenues at this
advertising.
point, in marketing advertising. So I would have to figure out, because there's really not a whole lot that goes in the old 29-22 category any longer, but the bulk of it for electronic advertising is going into 6139, and there you can see that we actually did come in significantly above what we had projected.
Okay, yes. That page, you did pretty good in the, let me sure I keep this line straight here. And that sheet metal worker, sheet metal license, just for the developments that we have in the city, so that's good. Superseded, covers what we initially thought. The last question on that page is on extra police, police duty, extra duty for police. And is that, when they go out and do extra duty, okay? Because I'm thinking they didn't hire as many police officers as we budgeted. So they go out and do extra duties. So would that coincide with, because they didn't have that many police officers, they didn't have the total amount, or is it different than what it was last year?
I don't think there's a connection there between the current police contingency that we have and what we do for extra duty. That's being driven more by what sort of opportunities are out there that in which our police are being asked to do extra things, and then they get compensated and the payments that go out for that are being compensated by the revenues that are coming in, so that's supposed to be a wash in terms of revenue and expenditures. Chief Alslavin would probably be able to explain that in some more detail, but I don't think there's a connection there between our size of our contingent and what we're doing on extra duty.
Thank you. And let me just go a couple more, and it was the, obviously the parking authority, we fixed the problems with the parking authority. And we are actually gonna be getting revenue that we initially budgeted.
This is, one member on the dais with whom I serve on the committee, the board of directors for the parking authority, we talked about this in great deal earlier today because we were looking at the revenue that was coming in. I think what we are seeing is 750,000 is probably too optimistic, but I do think that we are going to start seeing a slight uptick in that revenue in the subsequent years from where it's at. It looks to have been a very good year compared with 2017 in terms of what the parking authority was able to generate in revenue, and they still have some significant issues to deal with capital needs, with debt service, with putting in the brand new pay stations that are going to require those additional revenues they have this year to be invested in those particular items. We've also had some discussions as a result of today about the transfers that go back and forth for certain things between the city and the parking authority. And we're starting to sit down with Mr. Morgan and in trying to simplify that process. I think that whatever we can do to simplify the process is going to keep our general balance of revenues and expenditures about the same as it is right now. And I think it'll make I don't think you're gonna see much of a difference either on the revenue or the expenditure side once we get this done, but I think we will simplify how we do these transfers and spend a whole lot less time doing them. So that will be a cost savings in itself.
Okay. That'll help. Thank you. That's, below that, in the governmental revenue, are we being, how do I say, over exaggerating, over exaggerating, or are we over, our expectation have been exaggerated on how much grant money we're getting from the state, or should we?
No, I think at this point on intergovernmental revenue, we actually are coming in in all but the state grant for police training, we came in at 100% or higher. And I think right at this point, the folks who are working in police, in the health bureau, who are tracking these things are being very careful about what they expect that we're going to collect. And so I have great faith in what they're doing, that what they're estimating is going to be pretty much on target.
Okay. I was looking, they were 60% on the state grant for the police training, but you think that we are?
They came in right at 209,000 for that a year ago, and so I'm sure that was conditioning the 200,000 that they were anticipating for 2018, and it just didn't come in quite at the same amount, but I think, more than made up for that in other categories. And eventually, there's going to be some of that. I think what we try to do, everybody's going to make their best reasonable estimates based on historic data about where those numbers are going to come in, and everybody tries to be responsible about where that center point is going to be, where they can expect the money to come in. We're going to miss in a few cases, but we're also going to go over in a few cases. And I think with what we saw this year, and what we've done the last couple of years, that we've been pretty good in the aggregate and what our estimates are going to be on revenue coming in.
Okay, great. One last question on that one. I have a positive one, but one last question in regards to the CDBG reimbursement. What happened there? Is it because we're waiting for more reimbursement?
On the CDBG reimbursements, I know that some of that, Maria really is.
It runs out at the
part of that is the lead grant, and so that's affecting what the total revenue is coming in. That's another one that I would throw to DCED at this point. Ms. Quigney on their staff is very careful in terms of how she goes through the estimation of those things. And I have no doubt that whatever she came up with as estimate for 2019 is in line with what she thinks is going to be forthcoming.
Okay, good. And so I live in a Pasadena.
Mr. Garidi, if I may,
Go
for a
right
moment,
ahead.
I just want to point out to council that the kind of income that we were just discussing is called categorical funding. So if you don't get the money, you don't have the expense. So, you know, if we didn't get the money for for police training, we don't have the expense. If we don't get the lead money, that means we're not rehabbing homes. It's categorical, you can only spend it on that.
And the only reason why I asked, and I understand that, Mr. President, thank you. The only reason why I asked is because we obviously had some plans to do it because we budgeted at the beginning of the year, or last year. So if we budgeted, it's because there was some understanding that we were gonna do something. So either we didn't do the work, or didn't do the training, or we didn't get the money because, for some reason. So that's why I'm asking.
Well, if we got the money, then we're certainly obligated to expend it in
Yeah, but
the proper
sometimes,
manner.
yeah, sometimes, we do the work and then, or we get whatever we need to gather grants for, and then we get it reimbursed later on the next year or something. So it could be incoming in the next couple of months. So that's what I want to figure out, if it was an account receivable or not. But I didn't say that, but that's what I meant. Thank you. And the other thing is that the pilot program seems to be working well, and we obviously can continue doing that as much as we can, and hopefully help us get some of those non-tax revenues that Mr. Hoffman was talking about.
Absolutely.
So, those are all the questions that I had in the report. The first one, we're gonna have two more like this, but I think this is a good beginning, and we don't have to talk as much in the next one because we have the foundation of what we do. Any further comments from the public?
Just a few.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is this bond issue, it showed up in November. In December, they took it out. What happened to the money? Can you explain the bond issue?
I am very glad he asked that question. The monies would have been, if I go to page number 11,
I mean, you show it's a revenue source in November, and in December you showed you took it out.
he's correct, and I am going over now. If you take a look on page 11, and you look primarily, there was a portion of that money, a very small portion that was kept in the general fund. Most of that money was moved either into the capital fund or into the equipment fund. And you will notice when you look at November versus December that there were significant increases in both Fund 001, this is in the pooled cash, and in Fund 083, also in the pooled cash. And the bulk of that is where we transferred the bond proceeds into those particular items. So the money is still there, but it's now allocated to the appropriate accounts.
You just took it out of the general fund, okay. And this report you gave about, you saved $3 million in expenditures last year, and we increased your revenue by $3 million, right? So it's a $6 million swing according to this page. Again, Mayor, my last array, you had the opportunity to open the budget, and I said we're not changing tax rate. What we can do in the buildings is we put on the bottom of building savings. The council made with cuts, and the mayor made with cuts, and the net tax payable at point, then you would have on the bottom, real estate payable. You wouldn't be, your tax rate would be less, the tax bill would be less than, you would reduce the tax bill by 27% to whatever the cuts are, maybe cut 15% now, because you have $6 million here not to play with. So it's like the $6 million you picked up, you could maybe make some cuts and save them. I mentioned before, Mayor, and you know the person I'm talking about, he tells me he has to throw one or two people, he has to have one or two people have to be escorted out of apartments once or twice a month for not paying the rent. Now he's saying he might have to raise the rent $25, and most of them are fixed income, and they're not gonna be able to afford it. Some low income homeowners already tell me they're not gonna be able to afford it. I'm asking the mayor to reconsider, reopen the budget since we got this extra money. We're not changing the tax rate, Mayor, we're changing the tax bill. That's what I'm asking, to change the tax code, but you would make it.
Thank you, Mr. Hirschman. Thank
You
you.
know, I'm asking Mayor to do one more shot here, and keep the petitioners happy and other people happy now. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. All right, so that's the report. We move forward. We just want to talk a little bit about, revenue. I'm not sorry, review of the budget process. We put this in the agenda because we obviously, need to discuss a little further. So there are a couple of items on the agenda. I ask, Mr. Hanlon to talk a little bit, to give us a rundown of those, items, and if you have any comments on it.
Right down on the items, well, I made a list of items that people thought needed to be addressed, and the list is as disorganized as the budget process itself. So I'm putting it in a rational format. I guess with our discussion, we were thinking of doing something like this. We were going to describe the best budget practices. We were gonna describe our budget practice. And we're gonna create a priority of the issues that have been suggested by various people. We're going to classify them into whether they would need to be a charter amendment or they would need to be an amendment to the administrative code. And your suggestion was that we really get a firm legal opinion to clarify previous discrepancies about things like the December 15th date. What does that mean? Can budget memos go into effect by default? And should a tax increase go into effect by default? There's a litany of stuff out there, and then based on this list, you would create priorities. So I just have a bunch of stuff
Well,
listed in that list.
thank you, Mr. Hanlon, and, you know, I had several conversations with Mr. Hanlon about the budget process. We had a conversation this morning, and, this list basically signified some of the things that I had a question and concerns about, and, all the members of council also talked to Mr. Hanlon about, some of the things that are here in this intended list. And, so I asked them to include them all, and this is what the list is, my concerns, his concerns, other people's concerns. And I personally think, and I would say this now, that we need to, and I think other members of council have expressed same sentiments, that we need to get the budget, or start working on getting the budget in October. Probably October 1st, and obviously there have to be an amendment to the charter, and I discussed it with Mr. Hartzell earlier. I think it's just gonna be moving everything backward a little bit, and perhaps we can, see if we can, come to a better understanding, give us a little bit more time to discuss the budget. And I think it could be done in an amicable way. It doesn't have to be a back and forth thing. It could be done that we all work together so we can better understand. And you know, the other thing is that there are new people that come in all the time into council. Some of us know the budget process, others are just learning the budget process, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. And a lot more questions, a lot longer, and because of that, I think it would be better for us to work on that. I would ask my fellow council members to think about that, and it obviously has to be a charter question, a charter amendment, so it has to be in the ballot. We have usually 13, or not usually, it's a state law, 13 weeks before the election to put something, take it to the county, so they can put it in the ballot, and people can vote on it. So that's one issue. Some of the other issues are, as stated here, what do we do in regards to, we asked the solicitor for an opinion. Mr. Robinson had an issue one of the last meetings where we were discussing, do we vote now one time? Do we vote 3 times? How many times do we vote? And that took about 15 minutes just talking about that. And it was a solicitor opinion that we had to vote again. We ended up voting again on this. So there are other issues that come up, and I think it's for the betterment of our bodies, both the administration and the council, and also for the public that we have a smoother way of doing these projects. And that this is part of the discussion. Any comments from anybody? Mr. Robinson, go ahead, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Grady. I would just say that, I think the most important thing moving forward, because we had this discussion last year, I think at this very meeting, and with everything going on with the trial and the selection of a new mayor, then getting everything acclimated, I think a lot of that fell by the wayside. So I think one of the most important things to move forward would be to establish a timeline of how long we need to make these decisions. You talked about the 13 weeks if we would want to get something on the primary ballot, or the general, honestly, but we have, the deadline for the primary is coming up very, very quickly.
Well, we don't have time for that.
So, I think we would barely have enough time. I think we'd have to vote on something at the next meeting actually to make that. But what would be a good idea is to begin an initial structural conversation with the administration as to, the goal is to put this to October 1st. I know you share that goal, I share that goal, I think a number of our colleagues do as well. So, okay, we know we're going to that, but we're not gonna have that as a statutory limit this year because we can't get it onto the primary ballot. So, what is the timeline from the administration's perspective of, okay, if we need to present this to you by October 1st, here's when we need to begin these type of conversations, here's when we need to do this. Because I know that by the time that Mayor O'Connell was sworn in, because it's one of the first conversations he and I had, along with Mr. Hartzell, we had already passed the point where to get the budget introduced early, we were beyond the point of no return on that, even by the end of March, beginning of April, because they would have had to start the budget process at that point. So I think setting that timeline up, also looking at when we would want to put things on the ballot, because there's a couple things in here that there's a question, does it need to be a charter change, or could we change it through ordinance or just by our rules? So I think establishing the timeline is the first step towards that, and I would be very excited to work with you on that, and then we can move forward with it. But I think making a cleaner process, a better process is important. I think the research Mr. Hanlon talked about is going to be critical, looking at best practices in comparison to our process, because there are better ways to do things out there, and there are worse ways to do things out there. So having that to gauge is going to be important. So I think it's just about taking the time to set up a very clear timeline, do the research, have the meetings, have the discussions, so that we can have a unified pattern moving forward. So it's not just, well, I think this is a good idea, or Councilman Mota thinks this is a good idea, or Councilman Grady thinks this is a good idea, but we actually have the research. And now with the fact that we're going to be bringing on an additional staff member to do research, I think that can be an unbelievable asset. And I think one of the first things we should utilize that potential employee for when we get them is this project.
Good.
So, thank you.
So, the other thing is obviously the whole issue with the attorneys, and getting, looking at, and I think part of what the attorneys do here, the solicitors, is they look at what was the opinion of previous attorneys, and then how, this is gonna affect us. But then you look at it, and we all talked about this in the past several times, and I talked about it in previous, council sessions with other council members, is in regards to how those councils feel when a decision is made by the solicitor who is hired by the mayor, and do they feel, are we putting them in a position that do they feel, well, the opinion I'm gonna give you is the opinion that I think the mayor wants, not necessarily that the mayor told them to do that, but do they feel threatened, do they feel like, are we actually, being able to feel the process, or feel the concerns of both bodies? And people sometimes talk to me, we talked about getting our own attorney, or getting a solicitor to help us out, when we have a dispute that we don't really agree with the attorneys, because other people said something different in the past. So, other attorneys, or solicitors. So those are things that we need to clarify a little bit more as well.
And something to that, Mr. Grady, because I initially had proposed the idea, and I'm still not opposed to it, of us having our own solicitor, but after going through what we went through and a lot of effort that I've been putting into this and a lot of thought, it might, you had a very good point just now, that there might not be any direction to a particular solicitor as to I want this opinion, but they might feel compelled to do it.
Correct.
And that's as easy to happen with someone who would work for us, even on a part-time basis. So something to potentially look at as we're looking at, obviously, changes to the charter as we move forward is, making the position potentially full-time, but creating it as more of a commissioner. So that way it's someone who cannot just at the whim of the administration be fired. That it would have to be something where council and the administration would have to agree if there was a reason to terminate an employee, because obviously there's all sorts of reasons for that. But it's something where they wouldn't be at such a whim of they might lose their job. So that way they have a set amount of years that they know they're gonna have this job for X number of years unless we all agree that they shouldn't be there. And then that's a way for us to get more independent, unsolicited advice from someone who doesn't really have the fear of, I could get fired tomorrow and not know how to feed my kids. So I think that's something potentially to look at as well as we go through with all the charter changes.
So, those are things that we're talking about. I don't know if anybody has any other comments about what's on.
I just have one quick comment. Every opinion I've seen from the solicitor's office has been backed up with case law.
Yes.
There's case law cited in it, so it's not just,
I think
it's
it's.
not just they think so.
Correct, and I think it's just, and that's what I started saying, they usually go back to what other solicitors' opinions were. But then the people say, it's only a solicitor's opinion, not necessarily the law, you know? So, those things we need to clarify.
A court case cited in those memos is the law, it's not somebody else's opinion, that's a court case.
Well,
That was decided.
I was just saying today,
Yeah.
But, so we need to be clear on this, and there are certain things that through our finance department, finance committee, we can discuss further with some of the other council members. And saying that, unless anybody has anything else, I'd like to adjourn the meeting.
I just have a comment. What Mr. Robinson stated as concerning the solicitor's office, that's a great start. And we're looking at something just like that, which we'll be bringing to council soon.
That's good, great. And that was what, I'm sorry.
Solicitor's office. It's concerning the solicitor's office.
Yeah, but you said that, you said a couple of things, which one are you talking about?
The one Mr. Robinson was talking about, the solicitor's office, the commissioners, so they're not.
Oh, okay,
That
okay.
will fired by.
Okay, good.
By doing everything like that.
I just want-
That is something very worth pursuing, and we are doing that.
Okay, good. It's good. And, you know, we obviously been speaking about your lunch, and we're speaking about previous raids as
No,
well.
I understand.
Okay, so.
I was kind of thinking more of you, right?
That's a good way to end the meeting.
That's between you two. Hey, if nothing else, thank you for indulging us and